Good evening. Imagine a rough table with a humble meal. A bowl of bland porridge, a piece of stale, thick bread, and, if you're lucky, a few bites of dry, stringy meat. This is how most people ate in the Middle Ages, and that was only for those fortunate enough to eat. While kings and nobles celebrated lavish and varied banquets, ordinary peasants survived on a meager and repetitive diet. What circumstances made medieval food so unappealing to the masses? Let's find out. Before you settle in, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to know who's joining us from different corners of the world. This is Sleepy History, and my intention is to accompany you with this story as you drift off to sleep. In the simple homes of medieval peasants, the air wasn't filled with the aromas of cinnamon, ginger, or nutmeg. These exotic spices, brought from distant lands by merchants traveling the Silk Road, were an inaccessible luxury, reserved solely for the elite. Just imagine the long journey of a merchant crossing deserts and mountains just to bring a touch of wealth back to Europe. Their reward reached values unimaginable today. In the 11th century, a single pound of nutmeg could be exchanged for 7 well-fed oxen, a price that condemned most to simple flavors, marked by strong garlic, pungent mustard, and acidic vinegar, the few seasonings available to the peasantry. Adding to this monotony was the constant lack of fresh food. Without refrigeration or effective preservation methods, fruits and vegetables appeared only at certain times of the year, as brief exceptions. Those who owned a small plot of land cultivated onions, leeks, and cabbages, hearty vegetables that barely broke up a diet dominated by grains. Bread and porridge, made from barley, rye, or wheat, were the daily staples, sometimes accompanied by legumes such as peas and beans. Although this diet staved off hunger, it lacked essential nutrients, leading to widespread malnutrition that affected the growth and health of entire generations. Living, rather than living well, was the priority. For the medieval peasant, meat remained more of a longing than a common sight on their table. Although highly prized, it was infrequent. A family with some means might own a pig, a few chickens, or even a cow, but these animals were not considered merely food. They were valuable possessions, almost part of the household, and were not slaughtered without a significant reason. Meat was reserved for special occasions, such as weddings, religious celebrations, or when the animal was no longer useful for work, whether due to age or illness. When food was finally consumed, nothing was wasted. Every part was used. Offal and offal were common on the peasant table, providing nutrients and flavor in a limited diet. Their diet was also supplemented with small birds and game obtained through traps or poaching. But this practice involved enormous risk. Hunting in the feudal lords' forests was a serious crime, punished with harsh penalties that could include devastating fines, mutilation, or even death. The need to eat clashed directly with feudal power. Fish presented itself as a more accessible alternative to meat, especially for those who lived near rivers or the sea. But this was not fresh fish. Preservation was essential. To ensure reserves during the winter and periods of scarcity, fish was dried, smoked, or, more frequently, salted in large quantities. Herring, cod, and eels were stored in barrels covered with thick layers of salt. The result was food that lasted a long time, although with a taste and texture very different from today's. Freshwater fish, such as carp and pike, were considered a true luxury and were almost exclusively reserved for the nobility, who maintained private ponds on their estates to ensure a constant supply. Even in the water, social divisions were evident. The lack of fresh food forced the development of ingenious preservation methods. Pickling, fermentation, and drying were used to extend the shelf life of products. Cabbage was shredded and fermented to make sauerkraut. Cucumbers and onions were preserved in vinegar, while fruits like apples and pears were dried for winter. These foods added some variety to the peasant diet, although they were far from tasting fresh. Even the cornerstones of medieval food, such as bread and beer, were not always reliable. Some bakers adulterated the dough with ingredients like ground acorns, chalk, or sawdust, producing hard loaves with little nutritional value. Beer was also diluted with water to increase profits, giving certain breweries a bad reputation. In a time when drinking water was dangerous, Even watered-down beer was often the safest option, as its brewing process helped eliminate harmful bacteria. To understand how deficient the diet was back then, it's worth recalling a brief story. Yupa witnessed a phenomenon as disconcerting as it was terrifying: the dancing epidemic, also known as the dancing madness. Imagine any street where, suddenly, a person begins to move uncontrollably, dancing frenetically without any music, until collapsing from exhaustion. The most unsettling thing wasn't the initial outburst, but the collective hysteria that followed. Others joined in one after another, forming a sinister dance that could last for days or even weeks, without stopping to eat, drink, or sleep. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people writhed in the streets, screaming and groaning, some gripped by visions and convulsions, until their bodies, pushed to the limit, collapsed and they died. Entire cities, like Strasbourg in 1518, saw their inhabitants consumed in this deadly dance. This outbreak cannot be understood without considering the context of an already fragile life. The peasant diet, poor and repetitive, based almost entirely on cereals and legumes, lacked essential nutrients, leading to constant malnutrition and weakened immune systems. In this scenario of extreme vulnerability, it is believed that contamination of the grain with the fungus Claviceps purpurea, which causes ergotism or St. Anthony's fire, may have been a decisive factor. The toxic compounds of this fungus, present in bread and porridge made with infected grains, could cause convulsions, hallucinations, painful spasms, and involuntary movements. Thus, what was then interpreted as demonic possession or divine punishment is now understood as a tragic combination of causes: a body weakened by poor nutrition, the psychological pressure of living amidst plagues, famines, and superstitions, and the possible food poisoning. The dance craze was not an isolated incident, but a heartbreaking reflection of the precariousness that marked medieval life. This leads us to another particularly unpleasant aspect of the food of the time: the almost total absence of hygiene. With no knowledge of germs or food safety, contamination was constant. Livestock were often kept close to dwellings to take advantage of the warmth and protection, and their waste ended up seeping into the very spaces where food was prepared and consumed. In densely populated cities, the streets became filled with garbage and human excrement, contaminating the water and attracting pests. It is no surprise that foodborne illnesses were common, and not even the nobility were immune to these risks. The case of King John of England, remembered for his role in the Magna Carta, is often linked to a less than heroic and rather ordinary end. It is said that he died from fatal indigestion caused by overeating. Tradition tells us that his last meal included a large quantity of fresh peaches and new cider, a dangerous combination for medieval health. In a world with rudimentary hygiene and preservation practices, consuming fruit and fermented beverages carelessly was, quite literally, an invitation to disaster. Peaches, if not ripe or properly washed, could harbor dangerous bacteria. New cider, for its part, was a barely fermented beverage, with high sugar levels and the possible presence of yeasts and microorganisms capable of drastically altering the intestinal flora. The most likely result of such an excess was a severe bout of dysentery, an intestinal infection that causes intense diarrhea, severe cramps, and often fever. Even for a king with access to the best physicians of his time, whose knowledge of infections and rehydration was very limited, dysentery could prove fatal. Without electrolytes or intravenous hydration, extreme dehydration and the resulting salt imbalance could quickly lead to organ failure and death. Thus, the story of King John becomes a grim reminder that not even royalty escaped the harsh food and health conditions of the Middle Ages. The threat of disease always loomed over the medieval table. The Black Death, which wiped out nearly a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, spread in part thanks to the unsanitary conditions that fostered the proliferation of rats and fleas. Food markets were notorious breeding grounds for filth, with flies buzzing over meat and rodents scurrying among the stalls. It is almost miraculous that anyone managed to survive the perils of medieval food. Even so, amidst scarcity and disease, small oases of abundance existed. Monasteries and abbeys functioned as relatively prosperous spaces, with well-tended orchards and gardens that offered a greater variety of fresh produce. The monks were renowned for their culinary skills, and some even wrote cookbooks that offer a glimpse into a more elaborate cuisine typical of the upper classes. Of course, these foods were not intended for the common people. For the nobility, banquets were stages for displaying wealth and power. A royal feast could feature dozens of dishes, from roasted swans and peacocks to delicate cakes and elaborate sweets. Spices were used liberally, as were wine and beer, creating an atmosphere of excess and ostentation. However, even these opulent tables were not without risk. Food poisoning was common, with spoiled meats and rancid sauces punishing the stomachs of the nobility. Moreover, the enormous quantities of food consumed caused painful digestive problems, a reminder that even the privileged were not safe from the perils of medieval eating. In the dimly lit streets of a medieval city, a baker cautiously glances both ways before returning to his workshop. He then takes a sack of sawdust and mixes it into the dough, stretching his limited supply of flour to the limit. For many bakers, this kind of deception was the only way to survive. Bread formed the basis of the medieval diet, but its purity was frequently compromised. Unscrupulous artisans added ingredients like ground acorns, chalk, or sawdust to the dough to stretch the flour. The result was a heavy, coarse bread with little nutritional value. What was meant to sustain peasants through grueling days became yet another burden. In a time when clean drinking water was scarce, adulterated beer and wine became an uncomfortable but unavoidable necessity. Wells and rivers were often contaminated by human and animal waste, making them breeding grounds for disease. The alcohol in these drinks, even diluted, helped eliminate some of the harmful bacteria. Thus, peasants had to choose between the risk of contaminated water or the empty calories of watered-down beer. Despite the precariousness and constant dangers of medieval food, there were attempts to impose some order and protect the population from abuses. One example was the enactment of the Assisa pan y sed servitii, known as the Assisa of bread and beer, in 13th century England. This pioneering law sought not only to regulate the economy but also to protect public health. The Assisa set strict regulations on the price, weight, and quality of bread and beer, staples of the common diet. Bakers had to guarantee that their loaves met the established weight based on the value of the grain and that the quality was consistent. Brewers, for their part, were subject to inspections to prevent the adulteration of their products. The penalties for those who broke the law were severe. They could face fines capable of ruining them or the public punishment of the pillory, where the guilty party was exposed to ridicule and collective humiliation. The aim was to curb deception through fear and shame. However, the harsh realities of the Middle Ages greatly limited the effectiveness of these measures. Control mechanisms were scarce and rudimentary. There was no organized police force, and oversight fell to local lords or guilds with very limited resources. Added to this was the desperation of the poorest, which fueled a constant black market and drove merchants to continue adulterating their products. Mixing sawdust into bread, diluting beer, or using low-quality ingredients were ways to stretch resources and increase income in a subsistence economy. Therefore, the Assisa panis et servitii, while significant, did little to curb food adulteration, which remained a constant risk to public health. Thus, the life of the medieval peasant unfolded in a continuous compromise, a fragile balance between the pain of hunger and the bitter reality of adulterated food. Every bite served as a reminder of the instability of their existence, where even the most basic sustenance was not guaranteed. When delving into medieval food, it is important to remember that we are not just dealing with historical facts, but with the daily struggles of real people. Imagine a small, thatched hut, huddled against the cold of a medieval winter. Inside, a family gathers around a weak fire, their breath mingling with the steam rising from a pot of simmering stew. In one corner, a pig roots through the rushes covering the earthen floor, snorting and grunting, a constant presence in the daily life of the household. This was the reality for many medieval peasants, an existence closely intertwined with their livestock. The animals were usually kept indoors to protect them from the cold and prevent theft, and their manure and waste mingled with the straw and rushes that served as the only floor covering. These conditions created an ideal environment for disease, with fleas and lice proliferating unchecked. In the densely populated cities of medieval Europe, the situation was even more alarming. Narrow streets accumulated garbage and human waste, which polluted the air and seeped into water sources. In London, the River Thames served simultaneously as the city's water supply and sewage drain. It is not surprising that diseases spread rapidly, with outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid fever, and the dreaded Black Death. The latter, which ravaged Europe in the 14th century, was able to spread so quickly and cause so many deaths in part because of the unsanitary conditions in the cities. Fleas, carried by rats that thrived in the filth, became unwitting carriers of the disease, spreading it from person to person with terrifying efficiency. For the common peasant, there were few ways to escape these conditions. They were born, lived, and died immersed in them. Even the act of eating, which should have provided relief and sustenance, became a constant risk. Contemplating this reality, it is easy to feel discouraged by the fate of the medieval peasant. However, even amidst such darkness, there were small glimmers of hope. The solidarity among neighbors who shared what little they possessed, and the solace found in faith and community. The sound of church bells marked the rhythm of medieval life. For those who worked the land, these peals not only called to prayer but also offered a respite from the endless demands of work and hunger. In a world dominated by uncertainty, the church represented a pillar of stability and order. But this authority brought with it rules and restrictions, many of them related to food. The Catholic Church imposed frequent fasts and days without meat, especially during Lent. For 40 days before Easter, the faithful were expected to abstain from meat, dairy, and eggs, a particularly harsh requirement for those already struggling daily to put food on the table. The experience of a peasant family illustrates just how difficult these restrictions could be. Juan and his wife Maria worked from sunrise to sunset on a small plot of land, barely managing to produce enough to feed their 3 children. As Lent began, they faced an agonizing decision: observe the fast and further weaken their already malnourished bodies, or disobey the church in fear for the fate of their souls. Ultimately, they chose to fast, surviving on meager rations of bread, porridge, and some dried fish. By Easter, their faces were sunken and their movements heavy with exhaustion, but they found solace in the thought that their sacrifice would be rewarded in the afterlife. Despite the additional burdens imposed by these fasts, the church was not entirely indifferent to the plight of the poor. Monasteries and abbeys often acted as centers of aid, distributing bread and alms as an expression of Christian charity. Monks, thanks to their extensive lands and resources, could offer some relief to those suffering from hunger. Even so, this aid had clear limits. When harvests failed and famine spread, the need often exceeded the church's capacity to respond. And for those caught hunting in the royal forests, in a desperate attempt to add some fresh meat to their diet, compassion was nowhere to be found. Poachers, if caught, suffered extreme punishments, from mutilation to death, regardless of their circumstances. The church's influence on medieval food was undoubtedly ambiguous and contradictory. While monasteries could provide comfort and sustenance in difficult times, distributing aid and maintaining hospices, their strict religious rules also imposed new burdens. The numerous days of fasting and Lent, during which meat was forbidden and the diet was limited to bread, fish, and legumes, albeit imbued with spiritual meaning, posed an even greater nutritional challenge for a population already stretched to its limits. For peasant families, faith was both a source of strength in the face of poverty and an additional ordeal in the face of constant hunger, forcing them to adapt ingeniously to the restrictions imposed by their devotion. As we approach the final stretch of this journey through medieval food, a stark contrast emerges, revealing the profound inequalities of the era. We leave behind the humble porridge of the peasant to delve into the feasts of the nobility, veritable displays of opulence. Tables laden with exotic meats, whole roasted birds, dishes flavored with oriental spices, and select wines, all served with almost theatrical pomp. These meals were not mere banquets. They were displays of power, wealth, and status, a stark reminder of the vast gulf between the hunger suffered by the majority and the boundless extravagance of a privileged few. The abundance within a castle was a distorted reflection of the misery that reigned in the nearby huts. The great hall, the center of noble life, shimmered under the hypnotic flicker of numerous candles, their flames reflected on the faces of the guests. The walls, draped in luxurious tapestries, not only offered protection from the cold, but also narrated heroic deeds, courtly love affairs, and ancient legends, enveloping everyone in an atmosphere of tradition and splendor. High atop a dais that asserted their absolute authority, the lord and lady presided over a scene of excess and overflowing abundance. Along the length of the hall, a massive oak table seemed to buckle under the weight of countless dishes. Whole roasted pigs, their skin golden and crisp, shared space with silver platters bearing spiced peacocks, their feathers rearranged to impress the eye. Baskets laden with freshly baked bread displayed soft, white loaves, a stark contrast to the dark, coarse bread of the peasant. The air was thick with the aromas of saffron, cinnamon, and cloves, exotic and precious spices that testified to the host's immense wealth. This was not merely a meal. It was a statement of status, refinement, and power, a tangible demonstration of the gulf between nobility and mere survival. Beyond the glittering hall, the castle kitchens buzzed with activity. There, the master chef, a key figure at court, directed the work with precision and authority. His assistants moved tirelessly, turning meats over the open fire, stirring large pots of complex stews, and meticulously preparing elaborate dishes. Among them stood out the sugar delicacies, veritable works of art crafted from sugar, shaped like castles, unicorns, and dragons, designed to both dazzle the eye and delight the palate. For the cook, the banquet was a crucial occasion to showcase his talent, solidify his reputation, and secure his lord's favor. It was a delicate balance between honor and failure. As the feast unfolded, the nobles indulged in an endless succession of dishes. They tore at the tender meat of roast venison, a game reserved for the privileged. They savored creamy almond soups and sampled the refined blancmange, a preparation of shredded chicken with rice milk and sugar that exemplified the culinary sophistication of the time. Everything was accompanied by spiced wine brought from distant regions and beer stronger and more carefully brewed than that of the common folk. Yet even amidst such opulence, reminders of medieval fragility arose. Even among the elite, a noblewoman, flushed by wine and excess, could suddenly turn pale and withdraw from the table, overcome by unbridled wealth and a lack of moderation. A gentleman, his teeth already damaged by the consumption of sweets and a complete absence of oral hygiene, bit into a particularly tough piece of meat and winced in pain, proof that dental disease spared not even the rich. At the edges of the hall, the servants silently observed their master's excesses, with a mixture of suppressed envy and resentment. They knew that the next day they would return to their usual diet of coarse bread and porridge, and that the memory of that feast would be a cruel reminder of the chasm that separated their lives of subsistence from the world of abundance of their masters. When the last plates were cleared and the crumbs swept from the floor, the inequality of medieval food became impossible to ignore. For the nobility, these banquets were not mere meals. They were rituals of power, wealth, and status, carefully designed displays to demonstrate their dominance and their access to the finest delicacies the land and trade routes offered. They were theatrical performances of an abundance built upon the scarcity of others. For the vast majority of the population, however, food was a daily, constant, and exhausting struggle. Each day meant facing food shortages, the adulteration of the few available products, and the constant threat of disease, the result of poor nutrition and unsanitary conditions. The lavish and opulent noble table was a direct reflection of the empty and fragile peasant table, a stark image of the profound inequalities that defined life in the Middle Ages. In the modern world, surrounded by abundance and choices, it is easy to forget the hardships faced by our medieval ancestors. By understanding their struggles, we gain a deeper appreciation for our current comforts. As we sit down to our own meals, it is worthwhile to pause for a moment and acknowledge not only the flavors, but also the long progress that allows us to eat with greater safety and variety today. Thus, as we conclude this journey through medieval food, we do so with a necessary sense of gratitude and perspective. For in the grand tapestry of human history, our time is but a brief and privileged chapter, woven with the lives of countless people and the meals they shared, each a testament to the enduring resilience of the human spirit. As we have already seen, the medieval spice trade was as lucrative as it was dangerously risky. Those who managed to control the flow of these valuable goods from the far reaches of Asia to European markets could amass immense fortunes and extraordinary power. However, for those who dared to transport these spices thousands of miles, crossing deserts, mountains, and hostile territories, each journey was a constant gamble between profit and death. Pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were not just exotic flavors. They were symbols of wealth forged through risk, extreme effort, and, in many cases, blood. While in the bustling castle kitchens, the royal master chef toiled to coordinate a lavish banquet intended to please the nobility, most of the population could only imagine such extravagance. For the serf who toiled tirelessly in the fields, under the sun or rain, food was simple and repetitive. A piece of coarse, dark, and heavy bread, accompanied by a porridge, a thin stew made with wild herbs or whatever scraps were available. On a rare day, a small piece of salted pork or some dried fish might be added to barely give a hint of flavor to the almost liquid mixture. Most of the time, it was a bland and monotonous meal that barely satisfied hunger, a constant reminder of the unforgiving gap between the lives of the nobility and those who sustained them with their labor. The existence of the medieval peasant was a continuous struggle for survival, and nowhere was this more evident than in their daily diet. While the nobility indulged in exotic dishes, abundant meats, and expensive spices brought from distant lands, the common people lived on a meager and repetitive diet. Their lives revolved around subsistence, with food a constant and often unmet concern. But not even the most privileged were free from the dangers associated with medieval food. Opulent banquets, a symbol of aristocratic life, concealed deadly risks in a world without refrigeration or effective preservation methods. Food spoilage was a silent threat. Numerous nobles became seriously ill or died after consuming improperly preserved meats, adulterated wines, or spoiled fruit, excesses intended to display wealth and status, but which could, ironically, become their undoing. This was one of the great paradoxes of the Middle Ages. While some died of hunger, others succumbed to the dangers of unchecked abundance. For most of the population, however, the risks were even more severe. In a world where hunger was constant, the temptation to eat spoiled or contaminated food was often impossible to resist. This desperate choice was exacerbated in times of scarcity, when harvests failed due to droughts, floods, or plagues, and reserves dwindled. In those difficult years, people ate whatever they could find, even knowing it put their health or lives at risk. Acorns, weeds, and other wild plants were ground into a coarse flour used to make poor, low-nutrient bread. Desperation reached such extremes that even animals that had died from disease were consumed, despite the obvious danger of contagion. In those moments of extreme need, the line between life and death became blurred, and the simple act of eating was transformed into a cruel game of chance. Even in more favorable periods, medieval food was often adulterated in ways that would be unthinkable today. Unscrupulous bakers would lengthen their dough with additives like sawdust or chalk, while brewers would dilute their beer with water to increase their profits. These practices were not only dishonest but also dangerous, as they could cause serious illness and even death. The brewer who sold her brew in the village tavern was a common figure in medieval life and often bore the suspicion and resentment of the community. If the beer was weak or sour, she could be accused of adulterating it with harmful substances or even practicing witchcraft. In a world dominated by superstition, the line between poor fermentation and deadly poison became blurred. However, despite the countless challenges that marked medieval existence, people were not without small comforts that allowed them to endure the harshness of their reality. For the peasant family, gathered at the end of a long day around the hearth, a simple meal of bread and porridge was much more than physical sustenance. It was a moment of respite and togetherness. In the warm safety of their hut, they shared not only the day's stories, worries, and hopes, strengthening bonds that helped them face an unforgiving world. This humble act of eating together became an anchor of stability and affection. For monks and nuns who had dedicated their lives to prayer and service, the austere diet imposed by their rules was not seen as a lack, but as a form of spiritual nourishment and discipline. Renouncing the pleasures of the flesh and adopting a simple diet, often vegetarian or based on fish due to fasting, was understood as a path to the purification of the soul and a closer connection with the divine. In frugality, they found purpose, inner peace, and the strength necessary to transcend the hardships of the material world. But even in the monasteries and abbeys that dotted the medieval landscape, food didn't always offer solace. During Lent, when fasting and abstinence from meat were required, already limited diets were further restricted. For 40 days, many subsisted almost entirely on bread and water, and occasionally on a few vegetables or fish. For some, this period of deprivation was an opportunity to delve deeper into the spiritual life and draw closer to God. For others, however, it was a severe ordeal, as hunger eroded their will and tested their faith. In a world where food was scarce and unpredictable, voluntarily foregoing it could seem the height of folly. And yet, despite all the hardships, medieval people found ways to adapt and persevere. They learned to preserve food through salting, smoking, and drying, to make the most of every available ingredient, and to find joy in the simplest pleasures. In many ways, the history of medieval food is, above all, a story of resilience and ingenuity in the face of adversity. It's a reminder of how far we've come in terms of food security, variety, and abundance, but also of how much we still share with our ancestors. Just as they struggled to put food on the table and feed their families, we face the challenges of our own time, from climate change and food insecurity to the constant pressures of modern life. As we sit down today to plates overflowing with flavors and ingredients from every corner of the globe, it's easy to forget the hardships and sacrifices that made this reality possible. However, by understanding the history of our food and how it has shaped our culture and identity, we gain a deeper appreciation for today's abundance and diversity. The next time you bite into a juicy apple or savor a slice of warm, crusty bread, take a moment to reflect on the long and winding road that has brought us here. Remember the scarcity and monotony of the medieval peasant diet, the constant danger of adulteration, and the ever-present threat of famine. Consider, too, the extreme opulence of the nobility, their lavish banquets, and the irony that even they were not safe from the risks of contaminated food. Give thanks to the countless generations of farmers who worked the land with their own hands, the resourceful cooks who, with scarce or abundant resources, transformed ingredients into sustenance, and all those throughout history who have strived to bring food to our tables. Their legacy is one of resilience, creativity, and hope in the face of the most daunting challenges. Every bite we take today echoes their struggle and their ingenuity. If a medieval peasant could be transported to a modern supermarket, the experience would undoubtedly be overwhelming. They would be confronted with an abundance and variety of food that would defy all their understanding. They would marvel at exotic fruits and vegetables from distant lands, available year-round. They would gaze in awe at the gleaming refrigerated displays overflowing with fresh meats and fish, showing no signs of excessive salting or heavy smoking. And they would wander down endless aisles of packaged and processed foods, with colorful labels and promises of flavor and convenience. But beyond the initial awe, that peasant might also feel a deep unease, even distrust. Accustomed to a direct and tangible relationship with the origin of their food, they would wonder about the hidden costs and compromises necessary to sustain such abundance. They would question the methods used to grow fruits and vegetables, and the conditions in which animals are raised on factory farms. What additives and preservatives keep these products fresh and appealing for so long? What is the true impact of our food choices on health, the environment, and communities? His gaze, shaped by necessity and precariousness, would allow him to see beyond the superficial glitter and perceive the complexities and consequences of the modern food chain. In the end, that medieval peasant might shake his head in astonishment and return to his own time, content with the simple food that had sustained his people for generations. Because while our current food system offers us more variety and convenience than ever before, it is not without its challenges and contradictions. Just as the medieval peasant had to learn to make do with what little he had, to find sustenance and meaning amidst scarcity and hardship, we too are called to learn to navigate consciously within the complexities of our own food landscape. Eating should not be an automatic or merely functional act, but a decision that nourishes not only the body, but also the mind and spirit. In doing so, we honor the sacrifices of those who came before us and sow a legacy of health, balance, and sustainable abundance for those who will come after us. True wealth lies not only in what we put on our plates, but in the value we place on them and in the stories each food item carries with it. Within this vast and fascinating history of medieval bread, one exceptional figure emerges powerfully. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century mystic and scholar. Born into a noble family in what is now Germany, she entered monastic life at a young age and eventually became an abbess, even founding her own monasteries. However, reducing Hildegard to her religious role would be unfair and simplistic. In addition to her mystical visions, theological writings, and musical compositions, which are still performed today, Hildegard stood out for her extraordinary knowledge of nature, medicine, and nutrition. In an era when nutrition was poorly understood and based more on tradition than observation, she wrote with remarkable clarity about the properties of food and its direct impact on the body and mind. Her works, Physica and Causae et Curae, reveal a surprisingly advanced, almost modern view of the relationship between what we eat and the overall well-being of human beings. Long before science supported these ideas, Hildegard sought not only the salvation of the soul but also the health of the body. Her advice, born of careful observation and practical experience, reveals a woman ahead of her time, capable of uniting spirituality, nature, and nutrition into a single, coherent vision. In her treatise Physica, Hildegard gave special prominence to spelt, an ancient grain related to wheat, which she considered the best cereal for human consumption. She asserted that bread made with spelt strengthened the body, aided digestion, and contributed to a longer life, a bold and profoundly insightful statement for the 12th century. Similarly, she cautioned against consuming raw grains, which she considered harmful, demonstrating an intuitive understanding of the importance of proper food preparation. Hildegard did not merely theorize from afar. She directly oversaw the farmland and bakery of her abbey, applying her knowledge in practical ways. Under her guidance, the nuns produced high-quality spelt bread that not only fed the monastic community but was also distributed to the sick and poor in the surrounding area. This act was not merely charity but the practical expression of a philosophy that understood food as medicine, sustenance, and an act of love. Although spelt remained a relatively expensive product, beyond the reach of most medieval peasants, Hildegard's advocacy of this grain as a healthier alternative to common wheat proved remarkably prescient. Her legacy reminds us that, even in an era marked by scarcity, knowledge, observation, and intention could transform something as simple as bread into a tool for well-being and humanity. Modern nutritional science has ultimately confirmed many of Hildegard of Bingen's ideas, demonstrating that spelt has a higher protein content and is, for many people, easier to digest than highly processed modern wheat. Her legacy highlights how ancient wisdom can surprisingly coincide with contemporary scientific findings. The life and work of Saint Hildegard of Bingen offer a unique perspective on the central role bread played in medieval society. Bread was not merely a food intended to ensure daily sustenance. It also served as a clear marker of social status. The whiteness, texture, and fineness of a loaf revealed the position of the person who consumed it. At the same time, it could be considered a potential healing tool, as Hildegard demonstrated with her staunch advocacy for spelt. Her teachings, based on a remarkably holistic understanding of the relationship between food and health, anticipated modern concepts of nutrition and wellness that would take centuries to gain widespread acceptance. However, despite the efforts of visionary figures like her, for the vast majority of the medieval population, bread remained coarse, tasteless, and often insufficient. The unequal distribution of this essential food was yet another manifestation of the deep class divisions that permeated medieval society. For the poorest peasants, even the modest relief of having bread regularly could vanish in an instant due to the whims of the weather or fate, revealing the extreme fragility of their existence. In times of drought, floods, or plagues, when grain harvests failed, the threat of famine loomed relentlessly over entire villages and communities. During these dreaded periods of scarcity, food prices skyrocketed while wages plummeted, making it impossible for many peasants to even afford basic necessities. Without any social safety net, the poorest were left to their own devices, condemned to die of hunger or driven to extreme measures such as eating bark, wild herbs, or, in the most desperate cases, resorting to cannibalism. One of the most devastating catastrophes to strike medieval Europe was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, a veritable 7-year apocalypse that plunged the continent into a state of widespread starvation and misery. This tragedy was the result of a catastrophic confluence of factors. Climate change brought unusually cold and wet summers that ruined harvests, while constant warfare depleted resources and completely disrupted food production and transport. The chronicles of the time offer a dark and harrowing portrait of the human suffering experienced then. The Flemish monk William of Nanguis left particularly chilling accounts. He described how people resorted to eating dogs, horses, cats, and other unclean things. Even more disturbing is his claim that, driven by hunger, some consumed the bodies of executed criminals and that certain poor people, driven to the brink of desperation, even ate their own children. The famine hit regions like the Netherlands and Scandinavia particularly hard, where mortality rates skyrocketed, reaching between 10 and 25% of the population in certain areas. In the German city of Erfurt, the years of famine left staggering figures. An average of 16 deaths were recorded daily, compared to just 2 in normal times, a brutal reflection of the impact that food scarcity had on medieval life, even in the absence of extreme crises. Hunger was a constant presence on the peasants' horizon. Their fragile existence, subject to the weather and the whims of their lords, made food insecurity a pervasive threat. The harsh reality of famine cast a persistent shadow over the entire medieval world, a stark reminder of how precarious life was before modern agriculture and any form of social safety net. They lived in an era when even bread, the most basic necessity, could not be taken for granted, and where starvation lurked just one bad harvest away. As we continue to explore the culinary landscape of the Middle Ages, it becomes clear that this chronic scarcity not only shaped diets but also how people understood the world and their place in it. In a time when a full stomach was a privilege and a tough crust could be a treasure, food held a value difficult to grasp from our current perspective of abundance. Meat on the medieval table was, above all, a matter of class. For most peasants, meat was scarce, and when it did appear, it usually came from the toughest, most fibrous cuts of old animals, no longer useful for milk or fieldwork. Beef was almost non-existent for the common people, as cattle were too valuable as draft animals and sources of dairy to be slaughtered without reason. Pork and poultry were somewhat more accessible, but they were still considered luxuries in most households. Moreover, meat consumption varied not only according to social status but also according to region. In Slavic regions and parts of Scandinavia, for example, the population relied heavily on freshwater fish as their primary source of animal protein, taking advantage of its local abundance rather than land-based meat. Hunting, on the other hand, was an exclusive privilege of the nobility, who fiercely defended their rights to deer and other large game. This exclusivity was a clear expression of feudal power and a way to ensure that only they had access to the most valuable meats. A particularly revealing picture of the enormous inequality in meat consumption comes from the records of King Richard II cooks in the late 14th century. For a single royal banquet held in 1387, the kitchens prepared an enormous number of animals: 200 chickens, 400 sheep, 500 deer, and some 300 piglets. It was certainly food fit for a king. In stark contrast, a peasant family could expect to eat meat only a few times a year, almost always reserved for major religious holidays like Christmas and Easter. Even then, the portions were minimal and had been carefully preserved for months through salting or drying, patiently awaiting that special day. However, there was a brief and extraordinary moment in the history of medieval England when the peasantry gained access to an abundance normally reserved for their lords. Following the devastation of the Black Death, which wiped out up to half the population by the mid-14th century, the drastic labor shortage gave the surviving peasants unprecedented bargaining power. With far fewer mouths to feed and an unexpected amount of land available, many peasants found themselves in the unprecedented position of demanding better wages and living conditions. For several decades, the standard of living for ordinary people improved remarkably. Meat consumption increased, as more families could raise animals for their own sustenance instead of relying solely on the manorial markets. In several regions, wages doubled or even tripled, allowing them to supplement their usual diet of bread and porridge with chicken, pork, or, in exceptional cases, some beef. It was an unexpected golden age for a social class accustomed to deprivation. But this favorable equilibrium was short-lived. The landed gentry, alarmed by the growing power of the lower classes, reacted harshly. Laws were enacted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, and legal and fiscal measures were strengthened to tie the peasants back to the land. Tensions between a strengthened peasantry and an aristocracy determined to restore feudal order finally erupted in the violent peasant revolts of 1381. Although the uprising was brutally suppressed, with leaders executed and conquests annulled, it stands as stark evidence of the profound impact the Black Death had on medieval social structures. For a brief, luminous moment, the common people of England experienced a life less marked by scarcity and exhaustion, a failed foreshadowing of the social transformations that would come centuries later. If you've made it this far listening to this story, this is Sleepy History, and my intention is to build a community of people who love the night and knowledge, connected by the desire to understand more in order to live better. Knowing history is essential to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past, and that's why it's important to share this journey with other lovers of knowledge. And yet, for most of the Middle Ages and for the majority of the population, meat remained a rare and deeply desired delicacy. Its scarcity made it a powerful symbol of status and wealth, a constant reminder of the chasm separating those who had plenty from those who barely managed to survive. In the grand halls of castles and mansions, nobles and knights indulged in lavish platters of roasted game and delicate fowl, accompanied by fine wines and mead. In contrast, in humble peasant huts, a small piece of salted pork or a tough chicken leg was a hard-won prize, meant to be savored slowly and thoroughly. This difference in access to such a basic food lays bare the stark inequalities that marked life in the Middle Ages. In a world where even eating one's fill was a sign of privilege, the gap between rich and poor was as profound as that between a king's overflowing table and a peasant's nearly empty plate. As we have seen, that rare morsel of meat was one of the few moments of respite in a generally monotonous and bleak diet. However, not even this small pleasure escaped the control of religious power. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church exerted an overwhelming influence over daily life, and food was no exception. The religious calendar was replete with days of fasting and meat-free days, during which the consumption of animal products was strictly forbidden. The most important period of these restrictions was Lent, the 40 days leading up to Easter, conceived as a time of penance and reflection. During Lent, the Church forbade the consumption of meat, dairy products, and eggs, forcing the faithful to subsist on fish, vegetables, and bread. For the wealthy nobility, this was hardly an inconvenience. They could import exotic fruits, nuts, and spices to enrich their dishes, and their private ponds guaranteed a constant supply of fresh fish. For the poor, however, Lent meant an even more limited and repetitive diet than usual, deepening an already constant sense of deprivation. The Church's justification was based on the idea of penance and spiritual discipline. By renouncing the pleasures of the flesh and rich foods, the faithful were believed to purify their souls and symbolically share in the suffering of Christ. But in a reality where hunger and scarcity accompanied most people day after day, this voluntary renunciation must have felt like a bitter irony. For peasants who almost never ate meat, imposing new restrictions could seem like a cruel mockery, an added burden on an already exhausting life. Even so, the power of the Church was so great that few dared to openly defy its dietary rules. Disobedience implied not only social rejection but also the very real fear of eternal damnation. In an era when life after death was considered more important than earthly life, this threat proved a powerful deterrent, ensuring obedience even in times of greatest hardship. Monasteries and abbeys, for their part, were not only centers of faith but also key engines of medieval development. They were frequently at the forefront of agricultural innovation, pioneering new practices such as crop rotation, more efficient irrigation methods, and selective breeding of animals, resulting in more bountiful harvests and more resilient livestock. Furthermore, they served as essential custodians of classical knowledge about agriculture and food preservation, safeguarding knowledge from ancient Rome and Greece that would otherwise have been lost in a fragmented Europe. Beyond these advancements, the church played a central role in providing food assistance to the poor and hungry. Monasteries were renowned for distributing bread and beer to those in need, and many ran hospitals and hospices that offered care and sustenance to the sick and destitute. In an era without state welfare programs or formal social assistance systems, the church was often the only safety net for the most vulnerable. Its teachings on charity and condemnation of gluttony fostered a moral obligation for those with resources to share their abundance with the less fortunate. Of course, this charity was often accompanied by a marked paternalism and moral judgments. The poor were expected to be grateful for any help they received and to accept their condition as part of a divine order. Even so, for those on the brink of starvation, even the smallest gesture could mean the difference between life and death, a clear indication of the church's real impact on medieval food. As the Middle Ages progressed, the culinary gap between rich and poor only widened until it became a chasm. Towards the end of the 14th and 15th centuries, Europe entered what many historians call the Little Ice Age, a period characterized by lower temperatures and frequent weather disturbances. Harvests plummeted, punished by persistent droughts, destructive floods, and sudden frosts that ruined the fields. As a result, food prices rose sharply, leaving many commoners without the means to acquire even the bare necessities. Paradoxically, while agricultural production plummeted, the Black Death and its successive waves had drastically reduced the population, leading to labor shortages and higher wages for the survivors. However, this benefit was fleeting and failed to erase the deep inequalities. Faced with growing social tension and a desire to reaffirm their supremacy, the nobility and the emerging merchant class intensified conspicuous consumption as an open display of wealth and status. Lavish banquets became commonplace, with endless parades of exotic dishes and luxurious displays such as sugar sculptures and gilded peacocks, designed both to impress and to assert power. Meanwhile, the poor were forced to subsist on whatever scraps they could find. In times of extreme scarcity, many were forced to consume so-called famine bread, made from desperate mixtures of peas, beans, acorns, and, in dire situations, even sawdust. Others opted to gather wild plants or hunt any available animal, from small rodents to crows, a clear indication of the level of desperation reached. However, in the kitchens and gardens of ordinary people, the foundations of a more varied and resilient food culture were beginning to take shape. While beef was almost non-existent for the average European, the Incas had abundant animal sources. Andean camelids, such as the llama and alpaca, provided meat in addition to wool and transportation, consumed fresh or transformed into charca, a brilliant preservation method. Guinea pigs were another important source of protein, especially during celebrations. For populations near the coast or large bodies of water like Lake Titicaca, fish and shellfish, shrimp, sea urchins, and mollusks completed a rich and constant larder. Wild birds like ducks and partridges, and in jungle regions, animals like deer or peccaries, further expanded protein sources. Even something that would have been unsettling to a medieval peasant, the Inca diet included insects and larvae, making use of every available resource in the environment. This was complemented by an extraordinary variety of vegetables, fruits, and legumes. Squash, chili peppers of varying spiciness, beans, and lima beans coexisted with cherimoyas, licumas, guavas, avocados, and passion fruit, contributing intense flavors and essential nutrients. Various species of algae, both marine and freshwater, were also part of their diet. However, the key to this abundance lay not only in the food itself, but also in the agricultural techniques they developed. To master a territory as demanding as the Andes, they built impressive terraces on the mountain slopes. These structures prevented erosion and allowed them to cultivate crops at different ecological levels, each with its own microclimate, making the most of the available water. In marshy areas, they created raised fields or warawaru, elevated platforms surrounded by canals that regulated the temperature and protected crops from frost. An extensive irrigation system, comprised of kilometers of canals, ensured constant watering where needed. Crop rotation and the use of guano, the powerful natural fertilizer from seabirds, ensured the continuous fertility of the soil. Thus, the Inca diet was not merely a matter of sustenance, but rather the expression of a profound ecological understanding, a remarkable capacity for adaptation, and a sustainable management of resources that allowed them to thrive. This stood in stark contrast to the daily struggle for grain that defined the medieval peasant's table. Although the history of food in the Middle Ages is filled with hardship and deprivation, it is also a story of ingenuity, resilience, and hope. Faced with scarcity and oppression, people found ways to nourish not only their bodies but also their spirits, finding meaning and community in the act of sharing a meal. Looking to this complex past can serve as inspiration. In a world that still faces inequality and hunger today, this history reminds us of the fundamental nature of the right to food and the need to build fairer and more sustainable food systems. In our own kitchens and at our own tables, honoring this legacy means valuing the abundance available and sharing it with those who have less. Because, in the end, the true measure of a society is not the richness of its banquets, but how it feeds all its members. As we have seen, for most of the population of medieval Europe, eating meant facing scarcity, repetition, and risk every day. But there was one place where food was constant, varied, and refined: the royal court. While the peasants eked out a living on porridge and stale bread, the nobility indulged in the most exquisite delicacies the land had to offer. Imagine for a moment being the royal cook, not just a chef, but the ultimate authority on flavor, responsible for the enormous task of feeding the king and his entire court. Your day was anything but routine. It began long before dawn, in the cold, silent early hours. You were the mastermind behind a complex logistical operation, overseeing the arrival of rare and precious ingredients that converged in the castle courtyard from every corner of the kingdom. With the first light, that courtyard transformed into a vibrant, bustling market. Heavy carts entered one after another, creaking beneath barrels of Burgundy wine reserved for royalty. Large wheels of Alpine cheese arrived, releasing intense aromas, and chests of Oriental spices, treated like precious treasures, were unloaded from distant ports. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and cardamom were worth as much as silver. The king's hunters also made their entrance, hardened by the forest, with fresh deer and boar hanging from their saddles, ready to become roasts and pies fit for a royal feast. Maintaining this constant flow of provisions was as costly and complex as organizing a military campaign. In the vast, smoky, echoing kitchens of the castle, a small army of assistants worked under your watchful eye. Huge fireplaces blazed ceaselessly, illuminating the frenetic activity of preparation. Spits turned slowly, laden with meats ranging from young lambs to whole oxen, browning as their juices were collected for rich sauces. Large cauldrons simmered with aromatic stews and soups, where the abundance of ingredients met the skill of the cook. In another area, bakers covered in flour kneaded loaves and pastries with the precision that only experience can bring. The air was saturated with aromas: roasted meat, fresh herbs, and, dominating everything, the intense and expensive perfume of exotic spices, a constant promise of pleasure. You were the conductor of that perfectly ordered chaos, the artisan capable of transforming raw materials into culinary spectacle. As the banquet drew near, the final details were refined. Each dish was conceived to impress. A roasted swan, presented with its feathered neck elegantly arched, served as the visual centerpiece of the feast. A shimmering aspic, studded with fruit and finished with gold leaf, gleamed in the candlelight. And finally, the ultimate subtlety: a sugar sculpture in the shape of the royal coat of arms, painted with costly pigments. Nothing was merely food. Each creation was an ephemeral work of art, designed to dazzle first the eyes and then the palate. When the noble guests finally entered the grand hall and took their places, the decisive moment arrived. Your creations were about to be revealed. The servants, impeccably dressed, advanced in procession with trays, presenting each dish to the main table with calculated and ceremonious gestures. The diners reacted with exclamations and gestures of astonishment. A constant murmur rippled through the room as the delicacies were served. During those exceptional hours, they ate like gods, savoring foods from every corner of the known world. A dazzling display of power, wealth, and dominion. However, Even in this refined and exclusive setting, the threat of disease was ever present behind the facade of luxury. Despite their cost and refinement, the most elaborate dishes could conceal lethal spoilage, a direct consequence of poor hygiene and inadequate preservation methods. This was compounded by excess, as many nobles ate without restraint, far beyond what was reasonable. It was not uncommon for a courtier, driven by vanity or sheer gluttony, to collapse, literally overcome by his own excess and the limitations of the human body. Abundance, ironically, could be as dangerous as scarcity. Thus, although the royal banquet contrasted starkly with the meager rations of the common people, it was not without its risks. In a world without refrigeration or sanitation regulations, no one was truly safe from the dangers of food, neither rich nor poor. The medieval relationship with food was a fragile balance, always on the verge of scarcity or disease. Today, it is difficult to imagine the hardships our ancestors endured simply to avoid starvation. Even the most modest sectors of our society today enjoy a variety and quality of food that would have been inconceivable to a medieval king. We enter a brightly lit supermarket and find fruits and vegetables of every season, meats and cheeses from countless regions, spices and sauces from every tradition. We eat when we want and what we want, without the constant fear of hunger or poisoning. But perhaps, amidst this abundance, something has been lost. The medieval peasant, despite his suffering, maintained a deep connection with the land and the rhythm of the seasons. Every bite represented effort, work, and sacrifice. Though we might look upon him with compassion for his limited options today, he would likely regard our processed and packaged foods with a mixture of awe and distrust. And as the sun set, bathing the bustling port city of Venice in gold, a spice merchant named Lucas disembarked his ship, exhausted after months, even years, at sea. His precious cargo of pepper, ginger, cloves, and saffron traveled carefully secured. Lucas had braved the perils of the Silk Road, facing bandits, scorching deserts, and sandstorms under relentless heat, all to bring a piece of the Orient to the wealthiest tables in Europe. For him and others like him, the spice trade was as lucrative as it was extremely dangerous. The demand for these aromatic treasures was insatiable among the nobility, who used them not only to enhance the flavor of their dishes but, above all, to display wealth and status. For ordinary people, however, these fragrant spices remained an utterly unattainable luxury. Their meals continued to be bland and repetitive, an endless routine of coarse bread and watery stew. As Lucas navigated the winding canals of Venice to deliver his precious cargo to wealthy clients, he couldn't help but reflect on the deep divide that marked medieval society. The sumptuous banquets of the rich, with their lavishly spiced roasts, stood in stark contrast to the meager diet of the peasants, who subsisted on the bare minimum to avoid starvation. Their palates would never know the heat of pepper or the comforting sweetness of cinnamon. The life of a spice merchant was a perilous, itinerant existence, where fortunes rose and fell according to the whims of the sea or the desert sands. Lucas had faced bandit attacks, treacherous mountain passes, and the constant threat of disease. Even so, he pressed on, driven by the promise of wealth and the allure of the unknown. As he made his final deliveries and tallied his earnings, he couldn't shake the bitter realization that his prosperity was also a stark reminder of the inequalities that tore apart the medieval world. While he dined on saffron-scented stews and sipped spiced wines, most people went to bed hungry, dreaming of aromas that reached their noses only from the kitchens of the elite. With his spirits lifted, Lucas retired to his luxurious villa, knowing that at dawn he would set sail again for distant lands, chasing fortune in a world where the simple pleasure of a delicious meal remained a forbidden dream for almost everyone. With the first light of day, an exhausted housewife named Matilda stretched, already aware of the countless tasks that awaited her. For her, and for so many other women in medieval Europe, autumn was not a time of abundance and celebration, but a period of relentless work and growing anxiety as winter approached. With the days growing shorter and the cold advancing, Matilda knew she had little time to preserve the meager food harvested from the barren land. Nothing could be wasted. Every scrap counted, for survival through the harshest months depended on it. As she worked, her mind wandered to the feasts of the nobility, where exquisite meats and exotic delicacies were consumed without restraint. For her and her peasant neighbors, those scenes were almost a cruel mockery, a constant reminder of the chasm that separated the haves from the barely surviving. With calloused hands and an aching back, Matilda worked from sunrise to sunset, salting and smoking the little meat available, pickling vegetables in precious vinegar, and hanging herbs to dry on the roof beams. The effort was exhausting and repetitive, but she couldn't stop. She knew that every food item preserved could mean the difference between life and death when winter finally arrived. As the days wore on and the leaves turned ochre, Matilda's thoughts became increasingly focused on the harsh realities that lay ahead. Even with all her tireless effort, she knew that winter would bring scarcity and suffering. Meals would be reduced once again to coarse bread and watery porridge, repeated day after day. Hunger was a constant presence, a silent specter that seemed to await her just beyond the threshold, ready to pounce on the weakest. Even so, faced with such a bleak future, Matilda found a small comfort in the certainty that her work offered, at least, a chance to resist. With unwavering determination, she continued preserving what she could, her hands raw and her body exhausted, but with a will that refused to break. In a world dominated by deprivation, preserving food was an act of defiance, a way of opposing the relentless cruelty of fate. When the first snowflakes began to fall and the icy winds announced the arrival of winter, Matilda could only hope that her efforts had been enough. With her spirits heavy and her pantry barely stocked, she prepared for the long months to come, aware that, for her and for so many others, the struggle to survive had only just begun. Far away, in a grand castle surrounded by hills and forests, a feast of dazzling opulence was underway. The great hall vibrated with laughter and the clinking of glasses, as nobles from far and wide gathered to participate in a lavish display of power and wealth. At the head of the table, the lord of the castle savored a roasted swan, seasoned with exotic spices brought from distant lands. The tables were laden with delicacies, meat pies, hearty stews, and decadent desserts, the work of the castle's cooks. The air was thick with the aroma of roast meat and mulled wine, a stark contrast to the reality of the peasants toiling beyond the castle walls. For them, this feast was little more than a cruel fantasy, a glimpse into a world forever beyond their reach. While the nobles indulged in excess, the serfs huddled in their freezing huts, their empty stomachs and hunger their only companions. Their meals consisted of little more than thin porridge made from meager scraps. If they were lucky, some crust of stale bread. Meat, and even more so the luxuries of the Lord's table, were for them a distant, almost unreal idea, a painful symbol of the unbridgeable gap that separated those who had everything from those who barely survived. As the banquet dragged on and the wine flowed freely, the nobles grew increasingly boisterous. Their laughter echoed through the stone halls as they shared bawdy jokes and exaggerated tales of their exploits. Their flushed faces reflected both the heat of the bonfires and the self-satisfaction of overindulged appetites. Beyond the castle walls, the reality was quite different. The serfs huddled together in their misery, their stomachs twisted with hunger and their spirits crushed by the certainty that they would hardly ever know the pleasure of satiety or the peace of a genuine smile. For them, existence was an endless cycle of backbreaking labor and constant deprivation, an invisible chain that kept them forever in the same place. When the flames of the feast died down and the nobles retired to their comfortable chambers, the serfs returned to their meager shelters. The tantalizing aromas and laughter that had drifted through the night still lingered in their minds. Weary and empty, they prepared for another long, cold night, accompanied by hunger and the distant dream of a better life that faded like a mirage. In the bustling streets of a medieval city, a brewer named Angelica moved swiftly, carrying jugs of her latest brew. She was a strong, practical woman, dedicated to beer for so many years that no one could remember when she had started. Her trade was hard, with long days and meager profits, but it was all she knew. As she made her way through narrow alleyways, dodging dirt and refuse, Angelica felt an uncomfortable pang of guilt. With her last batch, she had taken a shortcut. Times had grown tough, and the price of grain had risen so much that it left her with barely any margin. She had no choice but to dilute the beer with a little more water. She knew it was a risky decision. If the authorities found out, she could face serious problems. But she also knew that her customers, mostly laborers and artisans, depended on that drink as a small escape from their exhausting routines. They sought the intense flavor and the brief sense of relief that a few mugs offered after a long day's work. However, costs had forced her to cut corners wherever possible. As she arrived at the tavern and began unloading, Angelica couldn't shake the feeling that she was betraying the trust of those who had supported her for years. She had always taken pride in her work, and the idea of serving watered-down beer was bitter to her. Even so, the alternatives were few. Either she adulterated her product, or she risked losing everything. With a heavy heart, she began serving the customers. She watched them drink eagerly and how, little by little, their expressions changed as they realized something was wrong. Some murmured in discontent. Others protested openly and demanded explanations for the drop in quality. Angelica tried to dodge the questions and calm things down, but the guilt lingered, growing with each pitcher she filled. She knew what she'd done wasn't right, but in a world where survival was a daily struggle, sometimes there was no other choice but to give in. As the night wore on and the customers began to leave, Angelica finally allowed herself a moment to stop. She looked at the empty pitchers and the small pile of coins on the counter, a bitter reminder of the harshness of her profession. With a weary sigh, she began cleaning, her mind filled with worries about how she would make it to the end of the month. For Angelica, and for so many other brewers like her, survival in a world of scarcity was a constant battle. Each day brought new obstacles and painful decisions, and the line between right and wrong blurred under the weight of necessity. Even so, they persevered, sustained by the hope that one day, somehow, all their effort and sacrifice would finally pay off, and they could taste a better life. In the grand halls of a medieval palace, a royal chef named Gum moved tirelessly through the kitchen, his face serious as he oversaw the preparations for the lavish evening banquet. Gum was a true master, renowned throughout the kingdom for creating dishes capable of dazzling even the most discerning palates. He moved from station to station, issuing orders and tasting sauces, unable to suppress a sense of pride in the abundance that surrounded him. The kitchen buzzed with activity, assistants hurrying around carrying the finest produce available. There were fattened birds and succulent roasts, coated in honey and spices, vast quantities of fresh, vibrantly colored fruits and vegetables, and exquisite cakes and sweets, each crafted as a unique piece. All of this was a clear demonstration of the court's wealth and power, and Gum relished being the mastermind behind such a display. Yet even amidst this opulence, a nagging unease lingered. He knew all too well the stark contrast between the lavish banquets he prepared for the nobility and the meager rations that constituted the common people's daily meals. This inequality troubled him, though he knew that openly questioning it could cost him everything he had achieved. When the final touches were complete and the first course was served, Gum watched from a corner as the nobles took their seats, their faces lighting up with anticipation. He watched as their expressions transformed as they tasted the dishes, the gestures of satisfaction and the murmurs of approval echoing through the room. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel the pride of a job well done. But as the night wore on and the noise grew, that familiar feeling of unease returned, tightening its grip on his chest, reminding him of the hidden price of such abundance. He thought then of the countless hungry mouths beyond the palace walls, faces scarred by poverty, eyes sunken from lack of food, people who had never experienced the simple, profound satisfaction of eating their fill. When the last dishes were cleared and the nobles departed for their chambers, heavy with the excess of the banquet, Gum finally allowed himself to stop. He leaned his back against the cold kitchen wall, closed his eyes, and let the weariness wash over him, his heart heavy with the injustice he had witnessed once again. In that momentary silence, he couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to live in a different world, one where food wasn't a privilege reserved for a select few, but a basic right available to everyone. He knew that this idea bordered on fantasy, something as distant as the stars that shone above the palace. And yet, he surprised himself by clinging to the hope that one day, somehow, the abundance that arose in those kitchens might also reach those who needed it most. Until that day arrived, Gum knew he would continue practicing his craft. He would cook for the nobility with expert hands, but also hands stained by guilt, bearing the awareness that his talent fueled the opulence of some while others barely survived. It was a weight that would always be with him, a constant reminder of the inequality and harshness that defined the heart of the medieval world. Looking back at the history of food in the Middle Ages, with its extreme deprivation and cruel contrasts, it is impossible not to feel gratitude for the relative abundance we enjoy today. The hardships endured by our ancestors, from the humblest serf to the most skilled artisan, remind us how far we have come in the struggle to guarantee access to the most basic necessities. However, that gratitude should not blind us, because even today, hunger and malnutrition persist in many parts of the world. Even surrounded by abundance, there are those who go to bed each night with empty stomachs and hearts heavy with anguish, trapped by inequalities that, although they take on new forms, are not so different from those that marked the Middle Ages. Looking to the past teaches us a clear lesson. The fight for food justice is far from over. It is a challenge that demands collective commitment, compassion, and the firm conviction that food is a fundamental human right. It will be a difficult struggle, but also a necessary one. We can draw strength from those who came before us, from the farmers who worked the land until exhaustion, from the women who preserved food to survive the winter, from the cooks and artisans caught between the pride of their work and the guilt of inequality. Their resilience reminds us that even in the hardest times, hope never truly disappeared. Dreaming of a world where no one goes hungry may seem fragile, almost as ephemeral as the steam rising from a bowl of porridge. But it is a dream worth defending, because in that yearning for a more just tomorrow lies the real possibility of transforming society and restoring hope to those who still need it. So let us move forward with a clear purpose and renewed determination, supported by the knowledge the past offers and the hope we project toward the future. Let us work to build a world where the abundance once confined to palace kitchens can also reach the stomachs of the poorest, and where the joys of the harvest are shared by all those who, through their labor, made it possible for the earth to bear fruit. Because, in the end, the struggle for food justice is not just about filling empty stomachs, but about something much deeper, about the very essence of what it means to be human, about the bonds of compassion, empathy, and mutual responsibility that unite us across time and generations. It is a struggle that will demand all our strength, our perseverance, and our courage, but it is also a struggle we cannot afford to lose. Therefore, let us move forward with open hearts and willing hands, knowing that every small effort counts. Only in this way can we aspire to a world where everyone knows the simple yet powerful joy of a full belly and a genuinely satisfied smile. In that world, the legacy of medieval food culture will not be marked solely by scarcity and deprivation, but can be reinterpreted as a story of resilience, learning, and hope, a testament to the human spirit and its capacity to overcome even the darkest periods. For the peasants who worked the land from the first ray of sunlight until nightfall, such abundance was simply unimaginable. Their existence was defined by constant scarcity. They lived with rarely satisfied stomachs, resigned to simple and repetitive meals. A typical day consisted of a bowl of watery porridge made from barley or rye, the daily staple, accompanied by a piece of dark, dense, and difficult to digest bread. In the best of cases, they might add a small piece of hard cheese or some dried peas, wrinkled with age, which provided a little more sustenance. Meat was an exceptional luxury, reserved for very special holidays like Christmas or Easter. And even then it was a bit of salted, stringy, and chewy pork, more symbolic than a true source of pleasure. The lack of variety in the peasant diet is astonishing today, almost inconceivable. While the nobility delighted in delicacies brought from distant lands, the common people were condemned to the same basic, bland, and repetitive foods, day after day. The monotony was only slightly broken by the changing seasons, which dictated what meager resources could be found. In spring, a few tender leaves and wild herbs, such as thyme or dandelions, offered momentary relief to the palate and the spirit. In summer, a few hard, bitter fruits, small wild apples gathered in the woods, represented a rare gift from nature. Autumn brought the harvest, a time of strenuous work, but also of relative abundance. It was the time to gather the fresh grains and, with some luck, slaughter 1 or 2 pigs whose meat was carefully salted so that it would last through the long, cold months. But this brief bounty was always followed by the shadow of winter, the most dreaded season of all. With the arrival of the cold, the days grew shorter and the nights became relentless. Families huddled around smoking fireplaces, trying to stave off hunger and cold with the little warmth available. The remaining food had to be rationed with extreme care to last until spring. The stew grew even more watery, the bread harder and more difficult to chew, and the feeling of emptiness in their stomachs became a constant presence. Starvation lurked like a silent specter, ready to claim the weakest and most vulnerable. Today, we find it hard to imagine such a fragile existence, in which a single bad harvest could mean the total ruin of an entire village. However, for most people who lived in the Middle Ages, this precariousness was not an exception, but the harsh, everyday reality of life. They lived entirely at the mercy of the elements, the whims of the nobility, and the often cruel caprices of fate. Each additional mouth to feed was both a blessing and a burden. One more life to protect, but also another empty stomach to be filled with ever-insufficient resources. In this fragile balance, even those slightly higher on the social ladder, skilled artisans, small merchants, or relatively prosperous free peasants, rarely enjoyed a significantly better diet than their poorer neighbors. A bowl of porridge might, on rare occasions, be enriched with a carefully portioned piece of butter or a scrap of meat, but the basics remained the same: a monotonous, repetitive, and monotonous diet. The same was true in monasteries and abbeys. Although monks generally ate better than most laypeople, bread, cheese, fish, legumes, and beer were regular features of their meals. Their diet remained austere and limited by modern standards. Expensive spices and exotic ingredients were still almost exclusively the privileges of the nobility and the great courts. Beer, meanwhile, was the quintessential everyday drink in the Middle Ages. It was consumed by men, women, and even children, not so much for pleasure, but out of necessity. Clean, safe water was scarce, and the fermentation process offered some protection against diseases transmitted by contaminated water. However, even this small relief was not guaranteed. Unscrupulous brewers, pressured by scarcity and high grain prices, adulterated their beverages, diluting them or adding unpleasant ingredients to increase the quantity and reduce costs. Something similar occurred with bread, the quintessential staple food. Dishonest bakers mixed the precious wheat flour with cheaper grains, bran, and even such extreme materials as sawdust or chalk. Although these practices were officially forbidden and could carry severe punishments if discovered, widespread desperation made them surprisingly common. It was a world where food was not an everyday pleasure, but a constant struggle, a relentless cycle of backbreaking labor and persistent hunger for all but a small, privileged minority. Meanwhile, the nobles, gathered in their grand halls, dined on elaborately prepared dishes, lavish meats, and fine wines, as if they lived in a completely different reality. The gap between their overflowing tables and the nearly empty bowls of the peasants was enormous. This divide fueled resentment, social tensions, and even occasional outbursts of rebellion. Though more commonly, there was a silent, bitter resignation. For many peasants, their fate seemed predetermined: to work tirelessly, endure scarcity, and accept suffering as an inevitable part of earthly life, hoping for a reward in the afterlife. And yet, even amidst such hardship, there were small moments of relief and celebration. Religious festivals and holidays offered brief glimpses of abundance. On these occasions, even the poorest could taste a little meat or some simple sweets. Weddings, baptisms, and community celebrations became opportunities to gather, share what little they had, and forget, if only for a few hours, the constant weight of scarcity. These fleeting moments of togetherness and joy helped make life bearable. They were reminders that, even in the face of almost constant adversity, the human spirit could endure. And endure it they did. Medieval people, hardened by necessity, bore their burdens with a tenacity and stoicism that we struggle to comprehend today. They faced each day with a somber determination, aware that their survival depended solely on their own effort, their ingenuity, and their capacity to resist. In a world where hunger always lurked around every corner, there was no room for idleness or self-pity. There was only one thing to do: keep going. Perhaps that is why tales of grand feasts and lavish meals exerted such a powerful fascination on the medieval imagination. In a society where hunger was a part of daily life, stories of tables overflowing with succulent meats, fresh fruit, and abundant sweets offered an irresistible escape. Myths and legends spoke of magical cauldrons that never ran dry and bountiful lands where no one knew scarcity or the pangs of an empty stomach. These tales reflected a deep and persistent yearning for abundance in a world marked by lack. But while the peasant could lose himself in these dreams, his reality remained harsh and demanding. The threat of famine never truly disappeared, always ready to descend upon the community at the first sign of drought, an unexpected plague, or a failed harvest. Even in periods considered prosperous, the diet of most of the population was far from adequate by today's nutritional standards. Rich almost exclusively in grains and poor in protein, vitamins, and minerals, it left many permanently weakened. This constant malnutrition had profound and lasting consequences for medieval society. Growth was stunted, the immune system weakened, and childbirth became even more perilous than it already was. The lack of nutrients reduced physical strength and stamina, leaving peasants to face the grueling work in the fields with exhausted and frail bodies. All of this fueled a pervasive sense of suffering and despair that seemed to hang over much of the medieval world like a persistent shadow. And yet life went on. Fields were sown and harvested, children were born and grew, and the relentless wheel of existence kept turning. The medieval peasant might lack material comforts, but he found solace in his faith, his family, and the bonds of his community. Joy arose wherever it could, in simple pleasures like the warmth of a fire on a frosty night or the feeling of contentment after a harvest meal. Season after season, many of them brutal, they endured with a resilience and adaptability that is hard not to admire. So, the next time you sit down to eat, it's worth pausing for a moment to appreciate the extraordinary variety and abundance available to you. Think of those medieval ancestors whose lives depended entirely on the whims of the weather and the land. And be grateful for the centuries of progress that separate us from those dark times marked by hunger. Because while the medieval peasant dreamed of a magical world of endless banquets, we live in an age where that dream is, surprisingly, very close to becoming a reality. And it is a privilege we should never forget. The peasantry's situation was further aggravated by the marked imbalance of their diet. While the nobility enjoyed a varied abundance of meats, fruits, and vegetables, the common serf survived almost exclusively on a limited and repetitive grain-based diet that defined his daily life. Porridge, gruel, and coarse bread formed the basis of his sustenance, supplemented by the small morsels he could obtain from his work. A typical peasant family could consider itself fortunate to own a cow, a pig, or a small flock of chickens. However, the milk, eggs, and meat these animals provided were a rare treat, reserved for special occasions or times of extreme need. Most of the time, any surplus was sold or paid as rent to their feudal lord, leaving little for the family's own consumption. Imagine, if you will, the stark contrast between a nobleman's sumptuous banquet and a serf's humble meal. In the castle's grand hall, the tables groaned under the weight of roast meats, savory pastries, exotic fruits, and fine cheeses. The air was filled with the aroma of saffron, cinnamon, and cloves as richly attired lords and ladies dined with gusto. Meanwhile, in a peasant family's cramped hut, a pot of watery porridge bubbled over the fire. The mother carefully divided the meager portion, ensuring that each family member received enough to stave off the gnawing hunger. The children's eyes widened at the sight of a small crust of bread, a welcome addition to their usual fare. The unbalanced nature of the peasant diet took a heavy toll on their health. Malnutrition was rampant, weakening the immune system and leaving the population vulnerable to disease. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was a common ailment that led to bleeding gums, loose teeth, and ultimately death if left untreated. In times of famine, known as seasons of misery, the situation became even more desperate. poor harvests due to droughts, floods, or plagues could spell disaster for entire regions with no reserves to draw upon. Peasant families were left to starve, their weakened bodies succumbing to hunger and disease. One particularly harrowing account comes from the chronicler Henry of Livonia, who described a famine in the early 13th century. He wrote of peasants driven to such desperation that they resorted to eating dogs, cats, and even corpses. While such extreme measures were rare, they serve as a stark reminder of the precarious nature of life for the medieval peasantry. The unequal distribution of food in medieval society was a clear reflection of the rigid class hierarchy that defined the era. While the nobility enjoyed a varied and abundant diet, the vast majority of the population lived on the brink of starvation, their meals monotonous and meager. This disparity would persist for centuries, with only gradual improvements in agricultural techniques and social reforms slowly narrowing the gap. As we continue our journey through the culinary landscape of the Middle Ages, we turn our attention to another scourge that plagued the population: adulterated food and drink. In an era before strict regulations and quality control, unscrupulous merchants and producers often resorted to cutting costs and deceiving their customers in the name of profit. One of the most frequent targets of adulteration was bread, a staple of the medieval diet. To stretch the limited amount of flour available, many bakers added all sorts of undesirable fillers. These included ground acorns, chalk, sawdust, and even crushed bones, all in an effort to increase the size of the loaves. The result was usually heavy, coarse bread with a sandy texture and almost no nutritional value or flavor. Beer and wine, the most consumed beverages of the time, were not immune to these practices either. In a time when clean drinking water was scarce, fermented beverages were considered safer. 54. However, dishonest brewers and winemakers often diluted their products to increase their profits. This resulted in watered-down, weak drinks, incapable of quenching thirst or providing any comfort. The story of Angelica, a brewer, illustrates this temptation well. A widow with children to support, she depended entirely on the modest income from her small brewery. After a particularly difficult year, with soaring grain prices and dwindling customers, Angelica decided to add water to her beer to stretch her production. At first, no one noticed, and coins began to pile up in her purse. But soon, people started commenting that the beer was weak and lacking in character, and her loyal customers went elsewhere. Her reputation was irreparably damaged, and Angelica ended up closing her business, leaving her family facing an uncertain future. Delving into the reality of medieval food, it becomes clear that the idealized image of a rustic and bountiful past is far from the truth. For most, eating was a daily struggle marked by scarcity, repetition, and the constant threat of adulterated food. In a world where food literally meant the difference between life and death, the peasant had few alternatives beyond accepting what little they could get. But the problems weren't limited to the quality or quantity of food. The very environment in which they ate was often uncomfortable and dangerous. In the next chapter, we will delve into the unsanitary conditions that dominated medieval life and how they further exacerbated food insecurity. Imagine a typical peasant dwelling, a small, cramped space, shared not only by people but also by farm animals. Chickens scratched the earthen floor in search of scraps, while a pig rummaged around in a corner hoping for leftovers. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, manure, and with smoke escaping from a central fire without a proper chimney. In such a place, the boundary between home and stable almost disappeared. During the colder months, livestock were kept inside peasant dwellings not only to protect them from thieves or wild animals, but also because the warmth they gave off helped them survive the winter. This arrangement, while practical, came at a huge cost in terms of hygiene and health. Animal waste accumulated in enclosed spaces, mingling with everyday filth and the almost complete absence of adequate systems for disposing of human waste. The result was an ideal environment for the spread of disease. Flies buzzed relentlessly, carrying filth from one place to another, landing on utensils, surfaces, and food. Food, so scarce and precious, was often contaminated before it even reached the mouth. What should have sustained life ended up, in many cases, weakening it even further. The consequences of these conditions were severe and made no distinction between rich and poor. Digestive disorders, parasitic infections, and food poisoning were common and affected the entire society, eroding collective health. Not even royalty was safe, as the case of King John of England demonstrates. In 1216, while campaigning against the rebellious barons who were trying to limit his authority, King John stopped in the town of Lynn. There, he indulged in a banquet that included peaches, an exotic and uncommon fruit at the time. Unbeknownst to him, the fruit had been improperly stored and was likely already rotting, producing dangerous toxins. Driven by appetite or perhaps gluttony, John overate. Shortly afterward, he fell gravely ill, suffering from severe dysentery accompanied by a high fever. Even so, he decided to continue his military campaign, a decision that proved fatal for his already weakened body. During the crossing of the treacherous Duash tidal flats, the rising waters trapped his baggage train, sweeping away crown jewels and royal treasures. The king managed to escape with his life, but his condition was critical. Less than 2 weeks later, he died, his reign ending not by the sword, but by a contaminated meal. The death of King John, though particularly dramatic, was not an exception in a world where food security was fragile and precarious. The Middle Ages were rife with invisible dangers: spoiled meat, contaminated water, and food handled without any knowledge of bacteria or toxins. Even the air was considered a threat. The miasmatic theory, which held that diseases spread through foul odors and noxious vapors, was dominant. Medieval cities, with their narrow streets, rotting garbage, and virtually non-existent sanitation, were seen as natural breeding grounds for disease. The stench of human waste, rotting food, and the byproducts of workshops and nascent industries mingled in a dense, fetid atmosphere. This corrupt air was believed to be the source of countless ills, a constant presence that transformed daily life into a silent struggle against disease and death. In reality, as we know today, it wasn't foul air that was the real culprit, but rather the unsanitary conditions themselves that allowed diseases to flourish with terrifying virulence. The Black Death, which wiped out approximately 1/3 of Europe's population in the 14th century, wasn't spread by invisible miasmas, but through fleas infected with the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which lived in abundance alongside rats and humans in the medieval environment. Overcrowding, persistent filth, and streets overflowing with refuse created the perfect breeding ground for the disease to take hold and spread like wildfire, respecting neither social boundaries nor privilege. The impact of these conditions on medieval food culture cannot be overstated. It wasn't simply a matter of unpleasant smells or occasional bouts of illness, but a constant and deadly threat looming over every meal. The simple act of eating, which we now consider a routine and relatively safe experience, was fraught with risk and uncertainty for the average medieval peasant. In a world where even the most basic hygiene standards were poor or non-existent, food was not only a source of sustenance, but also a potential vehicle for suffering and death. Added to chronic scarcity, monotonous diets, and a complete lack of scientific knowledge about bacteria and disease, this reality shaped a bleak and unappetizing culinary landscape, where every bite was, in essence, a gamble against fate. And yet, these were not the only obstacles. As we continue to explore why food in the medieval period was so harsh and precarious, we must remember that factors such as a lack of variety, difficulties in preserving food, unbalanced diets, and unsanitary conditions were only part of the problem. In a future chapter, we will focus on the role of the church in shaping the eating habits of the time and how religious doctrine, far from easing the burden, often exacerbated the already difficult conditions faced by the average medieval diner. But before we move on, it's worth pausing for a moment to reflect on the extraordinary resilience and adaptability of our ancestors. Faced with adversity that seems almost unimaginable to us today, they found ways to survive and even sustain entire communities for centuries. As we sit at our own tables, surrounded by abundance and variety, it's worth taking a moment to think about the medieval peasant, whose daily struggle for sustenance was a silent testament to the indomitable human spirit. For that peasant, daily hardships were further intensified by the strict religious doctrines of the Catholic Church. In a society where the Church wielded immense power and influence, Its teachings and mandates permeated every aspect of daily life, including the satisfaction of one of the most basic needs: food. Central to these restrictions were the concepts of fasting and abstinence. On numerous designated days throughout the year, especially during Lent, the faithful were required to abstain from eating meat and significantly reduce the amount of food they consumed. For the peasantry, already weakened by an insufficient and monotonous diet, these religious demands placed an especially heavy burden, adding a spiritual dimension to the physical hunger that marked their existence. Imagine the plight of a peasant family during the 40 days of Lent. They already subsisted on a meager diet of porridge and coarse bread, and now they were expected to forego even the occasional piece of salted pork or dried fish that, on rare occasions, brought some flavor and sustenance to their meals. The persistent rumbling of empty stomachs became a constant companion as they tried to maintain their piety in the face of hunger. The story of Juan and Matilda, a fictional but sadly representative peasant couple, illustrates the hardships many faced during this period. With a small plot of land and a few scrawny chickens, they could barely feed their 3 children, even in the best of times. When Lent arrived, they disciplinedly guarded their meager reserves of preserved meat and resigned themselves to a diet of watery porridge and boiled turnips. As the days passed, their energy dwindled and their tempers grew tense. The children, too young to grasp the spiritual meaning of sacrifice, cried from hunger. Juan, a deeply devout man, struggled to maintain his faith in the face of such deprivation, while Matilda silently dreamed of the delicious stew she would prepare when the fast was finally over. The couple's situation was not unique. Throughout the region, countless peasant families faced similar difficulties, their already limited diets further restricted by the dictates of the church. Some, driven by desperation, resorted to poaching in the manorial forests, risking severe punishment if caught. Others simply went days without food, their bodies weakening and their spirits crumbling under the weight of their devotion. While the intentions behind dietary restrictions were, in theory, noble to encourage spiritual reflection and penance, their impact on the peasantry was often devastating. In a society already marked by scarcity and inequality, the added burden of religious fasting could mean the difference between survival and demise. And yet, even amidst such hardship, there were glimmers of compassion. Monasteries and abbeys, with their extensive lands and relatively well-stocked pantries, often became havens for the starving. Monks and nuns, guided by vows of charity and hospitality, distributed bread and beer to the poor, offering brief relief from the persistent pain of hunger. One particularly memorable story is that of a kind abbess named Hildegard, who, upon seeing the gaunt faces of the peasants who came to her abbey seeking help, ordered the kitchens to prepare a hearty stew of vegetables and barley for all who asked for it. Those who received it returned home with renewed spirits, strengthened not only by the food but also by the unexpected act of humanity. But these acts of mercy were exceptions in a world where the gap between rich and poor remained profound and, for most, virtually insurmountable. The Church, despite preaching love and charity, frequently participated in maintaining a rigid social hierarchy that condemned the peasantry to constant poverty and hunger. Observing the role of religion in shaping food in medieval Europe makes evident the complex relationship between faith, power, and inequality that characterized the era. For the peasants, food was not only sustenance, but a daily reminder of their position in a world where even the most basic needs depended on the will of the powerful. As we have seen, the life of the medieval peasant was marked by constant deprivation, with food becoming a daily struggle rather than a source of relief. In stark contrast to this reality existed another world, that of the noble banquet. In the grand halls of castles and palaces, the aristocracy gathered to celebrate lavish feasts, a far cry from the meager diet of the majority. These banquets were more than just ostentation. They were a visible demonstration of the profound gulf between those who ruled and those who worked the land. Imagine a grand medieval feast. The hall glows with the flickering light of dozens of candles illuminating luxurious tapestries and gleaming metals. The tables overflow with abundant and elaborate dishes. In the center rests a roasted boar, golden and glistening with fat. Around it are arranged birds stuffed with herbs and spices brought from afar, game pies with fragrant fillings, and a profusion of brightly colored fruits and vegetables celebrating the fertility of the land. Presiding over everything was the royal chef, an expert who had dedicated entire days to preparing for the occasion, scouring fields and markets to ensure he obtained the finest ingredients and the freshest meats. Meanwhile, in the narrow, dimly lit streets of a medieval town, a baker named Ali wiped the sweat from his brow as he worked on his last batch. The harvest had been poor, and the price of grain had skyrocketed. To survive, Ali had secretly begun to stretch his dough with ground acorns, sawdust, or even chalk. It was a common practice among those trying to stay afloat, even if it meant sacrificing the quality and safety of the bread. As he kneaded, he also thought about the nearby brewery, known for diluting its beer to make it go further. In an era when clean water was scarce, beer and wine were the common drinks of the population. However, this often made their quality questionable. In larger cities, the authorities attempted to exert some control over the food and drink trade, though with limited success. Tasters were employed to ensure that beer met a minimum acceptable standard, and bakers caught adulterating their product could face fines or public shaming. In places like London, dishonest bakers were paraded through the streets in stocks, their own defective loaves dangling from their necks. Even so, these regulations were often inconsistently enforced, and punishments did not always curb deceptive practices. Many bakers and brewers treated the penalties as just another expense and continued to cut costs wherever possible. For ordinary people, this meant consuming food and drink of uncertain quality. Bread meant to nourish them could be laced with unsuitable or harmful ingredients. Beer intended to quench thirst was often so watered down that it offered little relief. It was yet another hardship added to an already precarious existence. When Ali took his last batch of bread out of the oven, he felt a pang of guilt. He knew his customers trusted him for honest, safe food, but in a world where survival demanded constant compromises, he felt he had no real alternatives. He could only hope his deceptions went unnoticed and that his bread offered some comfort, even if it wasn't what it promised to be. Beyond scarcity, spoilage, and adulteration, the medieval population also had to contend with the constant threat of disease. In an age without an understanding of germs or modern sanitation systems, food and water were often contaminated, making every meal a risk. Living conditions themselves undermined any notion of food safety. Many peasants shared their huts with livestock, with cows, pigs, or chickens living under the same roof. This offered some warmth and protection for the animals, but it meant living amidst constant filth. Animal waste and vermin were unavoidable. Fleas, lice, and rats were part of daily life, spreading disease and exacerbating human suffering, without the full extent of their danger being understood. In medieval cities, the situation was even more dire. Waste and excrement were thrown into narrow streets or nearby rivers. With no concept of hygiene or contagion, the population lived surrounded by filth, creating the ideal environment for disease to spread. The stench was unbearable, but the real threat lay in the countless invisible microbes that covered every surface, persistent and deadly. It is no wonder that people in the Middle Ages had such short lives, with diseases striking young and old alike. In that context, food was not only a source of energy but also a potential path to pain and death. Not even the nobility was entirely safe, despite their comparatively better living conditions. The story of King John of England serves as a stark warning. In 1216, during a military campaign, the monarch consumed an excess of peaches and cider, fell violently ill, and died a few days later. Contemporary chroniclers blamed gluttony, but modern historians consider it far more likely that it was food poisoning caused by spoiled fruit. The greatest calamity of the medieval world, the Black Death, was also closely linked to the unsanitary conditions in which the population lived. The disease spread through rats and fleas that thrived in the filth of towns and cities. With accumulated garbage and virtually non-existent hygiene, the arrival of the plague was inevitable, and its devastating impact wiped out nearly a third of Europe's population. The picture is bleak, but it's worth remembering that medieval people were no strangers to the concept of cleanliness. Although they lacked knowledge of the scientific mechanisms of disease transmission, they understood the importance of protecting food and water. Strict hygiene standards existed in monasteries and hospitals, and many housewives strove to keep their homes as clean as possible. However, in a world without refrigeration, proper sewage systems, or safe running water, the possibilities were limited. Every day became a constant struggle against spoilage and contamination, a struggle that was too often lost. Therefore, when you enjoy a meal in a clean, modern kitchen today, it's worth thinking about the medieval ancestors who faced that battle daily, almost always at a disadvantage. Thus, we reach the end of this journey through the shadowy depths of medieval food, that they managed to survive and even thrive on occasion. With such a scarce and uncertain food supply speaks to extraordinary human resilience. Scarcity, spoilage, and the endless repetition of gruel are enough to make us appreciate the simple pleasure of fresh fruit or a well-seasoned dish. Of course, the modern world is not without its problems. Inequality, waste, and environmental damage remain real challenges. Even so, the progress since the days of rancid meat and bland stews has been enormous. Today, we have a better understanding of nutrition, food security, and the importance of a balanced diet. We can preserve and transport food over great distances and enjoy flavors from all over the world at our own tables. The next time you sit down to eat, take a moment to appreciate it. Notice the combination of flavors, the freshness of the ingredients, and the care in the preparation, and think about those who lived through times of constant hunger and deprivation. With that, we come to the end of this story about medieval food. I hope you enjoyed this tale and that it helped you relax while listening to a bit of history. This is Sleepy History, your faithful companion on sleepless nights. If you enjoyed the story, please like and subscribe to become part of this nocturnal and curious community. Thanks for listening. Until the next adventure.